Hi everyone, Ben here from Rural Guitar School and Yas Guitar Tuition. Today we're going to do a little video about tone. A friend of mine has requested that I talk a little bit about sound and tone and trying to get a good tone out of your guitar. So today I'm going to try and cover a few points that have to do with tone. I find that tone's a very interesting subject because it is so broad and subjective. One person can think something and another person thinks something totally else. And it's also very relative to what you're doing. If you're a blues player or a natural sounding player, a country player, someone who plays with very little effects, you're going to have a totally different idea on the way that tone should be compared to a heavy metal guy or a guy who plays with a lot of effect, a lot of distortion. So it's very, very subjective. I'm more of a natural sounding player. I love my effects. I've got a bunch of them. Hopefully I'll show some of them to you. But I really like my guitars to sound like they sound. People use the term transparent. I don't like that term because I think it's really not a good way to describe using effects. But I like a natural sound out of my guitars. I don't see the point in buying really good instruments and then making them sound like something completely different. So that's just me. So first of all, number one, tone and tune. Sometimes I think people can get confused with sound and tone, especially in the early stages of your playing, with regards to the difference between tone and technique. Tone and being in tune. You can really dislike your sound and you're frustrated with it, but maybe it's something that is as simple as your technique needs to change a little bit. One thing I've noticed for myself is the older that I get, it really doesn't matter what guitar I pick up, I sort of end up sounding like myself anyway. And I think that's just because I figured out what I like. And I always go back and gravitate towards those certain things I enjoy when I play guitar. If you're a guy who plays electric guitar and you bend quite a few strings, you need to bend in tune. If you bend a string and you're a half step out, or you're sending yourself out of the scale of the key you're playing in, it's going to make you sound bad. And that's not a tonal thing. That's a tuning thing. That's a technique thing. So to start with, get your technique right and realize that there are fundamentals when playing bends, when using vibrato, that you need to obey so that you don't put yourself out of tune. For example, I'll tell you a story. Once, many years ago, I got the opportunity to record for a singer with a producer who I respected a great deal, and he worked with a lot of the guitar players I really looked up to, and it was my first big opportunity to record with this guy. And I walked into the studio and I had a great guitar. It was an old, one of my favorites actually, an American Telecaster Deluxe, expensive guitar, $4,500 they retailed when I first bought it 20 odd years ago. And I had no excuse not to sound good. I had a good amp, I had all the stuff. When I got into the studio and I was recording the song for this guy, I could see the producer in the other room saying to the singer that my guitar sounded like the intonation was out, that the tuning was out on the guitar, and so therefore it was frustrating him. I realized later on that actually part of the problem was not so much the guitar, but it was me. It was my vibrato. I was so nervous at the session that I really wasn't listening, and I was starting to just play the guitar nervously, and my vibrato had got so big that I was actually sending myself out of tune on some of my notes. So instead of doing a nice subtle vibrato, I was actually bending that note almost a half step out of tune on some of the notes I was playing in my solo. That in turn put me out of tune, made me sound bad. And I think that was a great lesson for me back then. Fortunately, it didn't cost me too much because the next time I went and worked with the same guy, he loved it and it worked out really great. But I learned for myself that it wasn't my tone or my instrument that was letting me down, it was my technique. So the first thing I can suggest when getting a great tone, make sure your technique is really sound. Vibrato, for example, is something that we use to create sustain. It's also used to create sound. If you listen to a guy like B.B. King, he uses a lot of vibrato to create his sound, which is a really quite a fast and furious vibrato, and it's quite wide. So he does bend and stretch the tone and the tune of his note to some degree. But if you stretch it too far, you put yourself out of tune and it will not work with the harmony of the rest of the song. Remember that vibrato is there to sustain a note, okay? So basically work on your technique, and that's another video for another time, to lengthen the amount of time you can make your notes ring for and sustain out more. So you got to think about all of these things that you're doing. Why am I using vibrato? Is it just because I'm using it, or am I actually trying to create a sound? It's really something important to consider when you're playing guitar. So the other thing is bending. When you're bending a note, make sure you're bending it in tune. If I'm in the key of, say, F or D minor, and I was using a D minor pentatonic scale, and I wanted to bend this second string at the 13th fret up to the root note, it has to sound like the D. If that note bends and I don't bend it quite far enough and I'm half a step out, it's going to sound bad. That's not a tone thing, that's a technique thing. You'll find that as your technique gets better, you start to sound more and more the same no matter what instrument you play, because it's all in your fingers. The way you do your vibrato, the way you bend your notes, the notes you hit and the notes you choose, it sounds like you. And that's one of the wonderful things about playing music, is you start to create your own sound. A sound that as soon as someone hears it, they go, "Ah, that's Ben." Okay, number 2. So gear, amps, guitars, pedals. As I said, I've got quite a lot of pedals. I've got a few different amps. The 3 main amps setups that I use is I have a Victory Duchess that I run through a Mezzo Recto cab. I have a Supro Blues King Junior 12, which I use for smaller type gigs. And then if I don't want to use an amp, I actually have a Strymon Iridium. Which is a digital profiling pedal which basically emulates an amplifier, and it's the closest thing that I've come across that sounds like a tube amp. I'm a tube amp guy. I like tube amps. I don't like solid state amps necessarily. I just don't think that they make my sound the way I want to hear it. It's not as warm to me. I find it harder to play through because I'm not responding to it in a fashion that I feel happy with. And that's half of it. You'll play a lot better if you like the way you sound. So find an amplifier that you can work through that suits what you want. Play hundreds of them. I've been through so many music shops and played so many different amplifiers. I've pretty much figured out now what I like. I like that Fendery American type sound and some of the old Marshall stuff. I like the new Victory that I've got. I like the Supro, but they're all sort of older type natural sounds. You just have to figure out what you like. Same with guitar effects. And people use the word transparent. I'm not sure that that's the right word that you should use from the point of view that every guitar effect, as soon as you put power through something, you're going to change the sound. You're going to make it different. So it's not so much transparent, but you got to think about the way that it's changing the sound and whether you like that. Is it adding something or is it detracting something from my sound? Here's a Strymon timeline for my delay. And basically a Strymon Big Sky for my reverb. I don't use the reverb in my amp a great deal. The Victory's got a digital reverb, which is just, you know, it's okay, but I really prefer the Strymon. I think it sounds great. The quality is incredible. They really are fantastic. The Strymon Timeline, the same thing. So many delays that you can get out of that one little box. It's incredible. So as far as overdrives are concerned, I use the Greer Lightspeed. I find it to be fantastic. It just adds so much warmth to my sound. It gives it some body. It sort of boosts those mids and makes it sound, to me, fantastic. I also use a Vox V810 sometimes, which is just a tube screamer pedal. That's Vox's version of it. It's discontinued now. You can't actually buy it. But I really love it. I've used that pedal sometimes at different festivals and gigs and had guys come up and say, "What's that silver pedal there on your board?" It sounds fantastic. And it's just one that I keep coming back to every so often. It's just a tube screamer circuit, but it does sound great. I don't know that there's anything particularly different about it, but it's a great little pedal. Talking about guitars, this is one of my favorite guitars of all time. I imported this from Japan. It's a 68 Stratocaster. It's Japanese made. I think it sounds as good as any American Stratocaster I've played. It's one of the last ones made in the Fujigen factory in the early 90s. I find that the Fujigen ones, to me, just personal preference again, I like them more. They stopped making them, I think, in about 93 in Japan in the Fujigen factory. So I don't think it's about money. This guitar really didn't cost me a lot of money to import it from Japan. You know, it cost me less than $1,000, and I think it sounds amazing. I've got other guitars, deluxe American guitars, which cost 5 times this instrument's value, and I don't think that they sound any better. They sound different, but they don't sound any better. And sound and tone is something where you don't always have to spend a fortune to get what you're after. You just have to try and look. You know, keep seeking, try and find what you want. You just got to find what you like, and use the old rule. You spend the most amount of money that you can afford to buy the gear that you want. Okay, number 3. You want to hear everything in your sound through a mix. So you basically want to make sure that in the context of what you're playing, you can be heard. So if that means that you're playing in a situation where there's 2 guitars, if they both sound the same, it's going to be really difficult to cut through on your own. You need to have something which is going to cover a different angle so that you can be heard, and you can be heard well. For example, many years ago I used to play with a guy in a band, and he played a Vox AC30. I played a Fender Hot Rod Deluxe amp, which was great. I used to take it on the road because most places, if I didn't need an amplifier, they would use them for backline. So my sound was always consistent, I felt. But I found more and more as I played with this guy, I found it harder to hear myself. I felt like sometimes at gigs we'd start off and I'd have my amp on maybe 5 and I could hear myself fine, but as time went on he'd turn it up, and that was a loud band. I'd be running my amplifier up to almost 9, even up to the full mount, and I could still not hear myself. I realized the problem was not so much the power of the amp, it was the frequencies weren't cutting through. I had to find something else that would boost some frequencies in my amplifier that I could cut through the mix. If you're finding you're not cutting through a mix, then your sound needs to change, your tone needs to change. You got to boost the frequencies that are going to help you to cut above a mix. I find that I like to boost around that sort of 1000K range, 1100, just to give my guitar a bit of push, especially when I'm playing lead. Just puts it above the top, and you don't have to play as loud because you're finding yourself a pocket in amongst the rest of the sound. And sometimes it's not about volume, it's about finding your place. And I think a lot of this, talking about tone, it's about finding your place in everything, finding your sound. What works? Where do you fit? Where do you feel comfortable? Okay, which brings me to number 4, the final aspect of this, which is listen. I find that listening is the biggest part about getting a great sound. If you don't listen a lot, you're not going to get a great sound. I don't care what anyone says. If you can't hear what's wrong with your technique, if you can't hear that your frequencies are being pushed too far in one direction to the point where it's too much, you're too trebly, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, it's hard to listen to because, there's too much top end in your guitar sound with your amps and everything else. If you scoop all the mids out of your guitar, basically go for something which is more like that sort of 90s heavy metal type sound that was used a lot. I remember when I was a kid, people used to talk about playing fat, and they would, take a lot of the mids out of their sound to make it sort of really thick. You might find it really hard to get through a mix in that case. Okay, so number 4, I find that this is the most important of all of the points I've talked about today. Listen. Listening is the most important thing when you play an instrument. If you don't listen to what you're doing, you don't listen to what those around you are doing, you've got no chance of having a good sound because you're hamstringing yourself to begin with. Our ears are the most important instrument we have when we play music. If you can't hear correctly and you don't think clearly about what you're playing, you've got no chance of having good sound. Really analyze what you're doing. Really think about your sound. Really look at what you're playing. Am I playing in tune? Am I bending my notes to the correct pitch? Get out a tuner. Bend a note. Have a look. Have I trained myself to hear out of tune? Sometimes people can think that they sound in tune, but they don't. We've all seen those people that go on Australian Idol, American Idol, those shows on TV, and people around them tell them they sound great, and they start to convince themselves that they do, but really everybody else doesn't agree. They don't think that they sound great, and it's a real shock to them because they've convinced themselves that they sound great. Make sure that what you think you're doing and what you're actually doing are on the same page. Get a tuner out. Am I bending my notes into pitch? Is my vibrato sending my notes out of tune, out of pitch? Is my sound cutting through a mix? Ask the guys you play with their opinion as to, am I overplaying? Is my sound cutting through? Is my sound friendly? Is it warm? Sometimes we can go over the top on the treble and have a sound, or those upper mids. I mentioned that I really like to boost some of those mids to cut through, but if you overdo that, you can start to take someone's head off. It's like those top range frequencies will really make you sound shrill and quite awful when gone over the other side. A lot of it's about balance. It's about finding that point in between the good and the bad, and at that point everything works in harmony. It just sounds fantastic. You go too far over that point, it sounds bad again. You go under that point, it sounds bad again. Spend some time in a recording studio. Actually spend some time with someone who knows about frequencies. Listening is really important. I can't stress it enough. It's all about humility. The more humble you are when you play an instrument, the faster you're going to project yourself into sounding really great. And the more likely you are to be able to take on board all of the information you need to sound really good. I think being a performer is one of those things where it's pretty easy for us to really want to get out there and be seen, be noticed. But the guys who are really, really good are often, funnily enough, the ones who are listening, who are watching, who are putting other people first, who are making other people sound good. And I think that a little bit of humility, listening, thinking is the first step towards good tone. I hope you've enjoyed today's discussion about tone and sound. I hope it's been useful. I'm Ben from the Rural Guitar School. I've enjoyed talking with you today, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Goodbye.